Isabeau's husband, Charles VI, went so mad he thought he was made of glass, but his rare lucid moments were even darker. When Isabeau fled, Charles snapped to his senses and inflicted an unspeakable revenge. Isabeau of Bavaria was born in 1370, and from the noble house of Wittelsbach, Isabeau was directly related to the Holy Roman Emperor. However, because of the turmoil in her life, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria has gone down as one of the greatest villains in history. By the end of her reign, so much scandal, revenge, and death had happened around her. People even whispered that she was actually a sorceress. However, what's the truth behind this vicious legend? Well, we're about to find out. Isabeau adored putting on enormous displays of fashion as well as wealth, which didn't make her any more loved by the French people. She and her equally extra sister-in-law Valentina wore dresses dripping in gems, coiled their hair into massive braids, and wore hats so big the palace had to renovate doorways to allow the women through them. Her mother, Tadia, was the favorite child of her wealthy parents, and spent most of her life pampered and protected. Meanwhile, her father, Stephan's nickname was the Fob, because of his extravagant tastes. Somehow, as we'll see, Isabeau managed to be even more attention-seeking. In 1383, Isabeau's uncle started scheming to marry her off to the next king of France, the handsome and vivacious Charles VI. He was 17 years old at the time, and if that sounds young for a prince to even think about getting married, consider that Isabeau was only 13 or 14. But that's not even the weirdest part. Envisioning his little girl as the Queen of France, Isabeau's father, Stephan, sent her over to Charles so he could get a little sneak peek. Except, Stephan didn't tell Isabeau what was actually going on, and made the teenager believe she was going to France on a religious pilgrimage instead. Now, even from a tender age, it was clear to anyone who saw her that Isabeau was going to be a looker. She apparently may have inherited her mother's dark Italian features, which gave her a mesmerizing beauty in an era that preferred blondes. But when Isabeau met Charles for the first time, she had to go through a mortifying ordeal. The customs of the time forced her to get physically inspected by the prince and his advisors. Usually the bride had to be naked to do this, but lucky for Isabeau, her father refused this part of the tradition, and she got to endure the ritual fully clothed. And upon seeing her framed beauty, the young prince reportedly greatly desired to gaze at her and possess. Charles was so excited to marry Isabeau, he fast-tracked the process and insisted on a wedding just 3 days later. According to sources from the time, their July 16, 1385 wedding was an absolute bash to end all bashes, with guests partying late into the night. It was a success, but Isabeau wouldn't understand the nightmare she just walked into until much later. Charles had an undeniable physical attraction, and multiple sources from the time comment on how great they looked on their wedding night. However, that was all they had. At the time she married Charles, Isabeau couldn't even speak French, and she kept a heavy German accent for the rest of her life. Isabeau and Charles' honeymoon period didn't last long either. Just a day after their wedding, Charles went off on a campaign, and Isabeau went to live with his step-great-grandmother. She was a traditional battle-axe if there ever was one, and she whipped Isabeau into shape as a true Queen of France. To her many enemies at court, Isabeau was a luxuriating and extravagant woman. One source claims that the reason why she had so many pregnancies throughout her life was because she loved the gifts that came with expecting a new heir to the throne, while another source depicts her living on the delights of the flesh. Regardless, she was living her best life. Charles and Isabeau's royal wedding was lavish, for sure, but Isabeau's coronation blew it right out of the water. It had all the esteemed guests acting like right fools. Isabeau's sister-in-law, Valentina, escorted herself across the Alps with 1,300 knights, and all the noble women in the coronation arrived in litters. The procession alone lasted all day, At the time of these endless coronation festivities, which lasted a full 5 days, Isabeau was actually 7 months pregnant. During the first day of the coronation, she nearly fainted from the heat, and then had to continue on for the next 4 days. This was a warning sign. Don't mess with Isabeau, because she will survive. Yet, a tragic plot twist was on the horizon. In 1392, Charles VI suffered an infamous episode that changed his reign forever. He had a total mental breakdown while campaigning, and attacked and killed 4 of his own men in a fit of paranoia. Immediately after the outburst, he fell into a coma, and suddenly Isabeau had gone from a hot trophy wife to one of the only people that could hold Charles's reign together. At the time, the French court was sure that Charles's belt of insanity was divine intervention. Why else would the perfectly healthy king turn so suddenly horrific? But the modern diagnosis is even darker. According to many historians, King Charles most likely suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. In other words, it was only going to get worse. And for all that Isabeau was naturally a bit of a glory hound, historians suggest a more disturbing reason for her extravagance. With her husband's violent mental illness and the upheaval at court, experts believe her wild fashions and attention-seeking ways were Isabeau's way of coping with her new life, as well as a ploy to distract courtiers away from the king. Now, when Charles started to recover from his coma, his doctor suggested he put his feet up, relax, and take part in some fun activities. So following this advice, Charles decided to crash the party Isabeau was throwing for her newly married lady-in-waiting. The plan was to disguise himself and his friends as wild men and invade the ballroom. Does that sound like a good idea? Well, the notorious incident has now gone down in history. During this, Charles tried to cut it up happily on the dance floor with 5 of his attendants, only for his brother Louis to knock over a torch and start a massive raging fire. Turns out this was one of those oops moments where everything was not going to be okay. In the chaos, shadows and smoke of the fiery room, Isabeau could only look on in horror as the dancers went up in flames, knowing her husband was among them. She was apparently so terrified she fainted on the spot, and this was the woman who kept it together through her 5-day coronation. And when the smoke cleared, the awful truth came out. The king had survived the blaze, but 4 of his companions perished. The aftermath of the ball had dire consequences. Though everyone blamed Louis for the slip of the hand, they also criticized Isabeau's extravagance in having the ball in the first place, and the queen grew increasingly unpopular with the French court. Unfortunately, this would only be Louis and Isabeau's first scandal together. By the time Charles was very far gone into his mental illness, Isabeau was only 22 years old, and the royal couple already had 3 living children together. Eventually, she would give birth to a mind-boggling 12 children. But as we'll see, there seemed to be a curse on the House of Bavaria. And Isabeau was in for immense tragedy. Isabeau was understandably upset that her husband went insane, and her reaction was not that great. The queen eventually removed herself from the royal palace during the worst of his illness, attracting bitter criticism from the court for her abandonment of her king. But Isabeau also came up with a scandalous plan to help him. Since Charles would no longer see her in his bedchamber, Isabeau did the super-progressive thing and gave him a mistress. With the queen's approval, the court tracked down the daughter of a horse dealer to keep the king satisfied even in the throes of his schizophrenia. She reportedly shared an uncanny resemblance with Isabeau, earning her the nickname the Little Queen. Yet since she was merely a horse dealer's daughter, Isabeau knew her high position in court was on the lockdown. Besides, she was no saint in the bedroom either. As Charles' madness grew more pronounced, rumors started swirling that Isabeau developed a wandering eye for the worst person imaginable. According to some sources, she took up with her own brother-in-law, Louis, the same guy who nearly burned everyone alive. But that wasn't even the worst part, because Louis was King Charles VI's brother. Their relationship was considered incest. The nobles were repulsed and angry, and when Isabeau and Louis formed an alliance in court, it only seemed to prove the affair. With Charles incapacitated pretty much all the time, Isabeau's influence grew in court, and her enemies grew along with it. Her absolute nemesis was Charles' cousin, John the Fearless. And, let's just say, you don't get that nickname without earning it. Jealous of Isabeau and Louis's joint power, John plotted a disturbing act of revenge. In 1405, John the Fearless invaded Paris with a terrifying troop of 1,000 knights. Then he won up himself and actually kidnapped Isabeau's young son, Louis, who was the heir to the throne. He eventually returned the little boy back to Paris under an armed guard of his own men, just to send a message. But Isabeau's reaction to all this was legendary. John's actions pushed France to the brink of war, with different factions fighting about how to respond to the insult. Isabeau, however, just took her son back, and then calmly soothed over the dispute, cool as a cucumber. Sadly, though, that was just the beginning of the nightmare. At the height of Charles's madness, Charles thought he was made of glass, and he went so far as to put iron rods inside its clothes to reinforce his body. He also couldn't even recognize Isabeau, and would even order her out of the room in a rage if she came to visit his bedchamber. One of his deranged responses was so disturbing, it's impossible to forget. During a certain instance, he whispered feverishly to his attendant, "Who is this woman obstructing my view? Find out what she wants, and stop her from annoying and bothering me." Now in 1407, John the Fearless performed his most despicable act yet. He ordered the assassination of her rumored lover, Louis, and he did not do it with mercy. According to the reports of the time, John's hired assailants chopped Louis into pieces and left him in the gutter. Then the Fearless dealt Isabeau a final knife twist. After a coy period of denying the hit, John eventually proudly and publicly admitted to it. Then, to rub salt in the wound, he claimed he had actually done it, for the Queen's honor, as a way to silence all the nasty rumors about her affair with Louis. With all this infighting, it was only a matter of time before civil war raged in France between various relatives of the still insane King Charles, with Isabeau right in the middle, desperately trying to protect her children. In 1411, conflict erupted, and the horrors went all the way to Queen Isabeau's doorstep. At one point, a group of rebels broke into Isabeau's home and kidnapped 15 of her ladies-in-waiting. But the deepest terror was yet to come. Starting in 1415, with civil conflict still raging around her, Isabeau suffered an unspeakable horror. Late that December, her son and heir to the throne, Louis, passed away suddenly when he was just 18 years old. Less than 2 years later, her next eldest son, John, also perished. Throughout these uncertain times, Isabeau did everything she could to survive and to keep the royal line intact. This often meant switching sides to whoever was in power at the time. Leading many to accuse her of disloyalty, her survival instinct was so strong, she even eventually allied with her old nemesis, John the Fearless. And after watching the demise of 2 of her children in short succession, Isabeau passed the inheritance to her youngest son, the 14-year-old Charles. Unfortunately for Isabeau, Charles would deal her an utterly cold-hearted betrayal. The boy was staunchly against her new ally, John the Fearless, and one day the pimply-faced teen punished him to the nth degree. In a case of poetic justice, Charles lured John to a public bridge, then had him hacked 2 pieces. The young Dauphin's brutal case of teenage rebellion had drastic effects on both Isabeau and France. King Charles VI and the Queen immediately disowned their son, and the Dauphin's cruel act undid decades of Isabeau's political and maternal work. Instead, the King and Queen were forced into one of the most infamous acts of the 15th century. Yes, France was an absolute shambles by this time, and after all, While the civil conflict raged internally, the country was still fighting English forces on its borders and losing badly. With little bargaining power and 0 eligible heirs left, the king and queen had to sign the notorious Treaty of Troyes, which handed over much of France to the King of England, Henry V. As per usual, Isabeau got the short end of this deal. Because Charles was too ill, she was the one who actually signed the contract. Forever after, she was known as the woman who had sworn away France, and decades, even centuries later, people still blamed Isabeau for the fall of the mighty empire. After signing the Treaty of Troyes and the death of King Charles VI in 1422, Isabeau wisely retreated from any political meddling, living out the rest of her days in relative peace. In October 1435, she died at the ripe age of 65, an absolutely astronomical number when you think about how much she had to go through to get there. Now, in the depths of his madness, Charles would often tear apart his clothes, urinate on his furniture, and throw his possessions into the fire. It's hard to blame Isabeau for keeping her distance. Not a great vibe to be around. King Charles VI's sickness didn't just make him weak and incapacitated, it could also make him incredibly cruel. According to some sources, Isabeau established a country getaway in a farmhouse in northern France and took up with a local lover. And when Charles found out about it during one of his lucid periods, he reportedly drowned the man in the nearby river. Thanks for watching History Exposé. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep on exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factionate, for more incredible facts about everything.